Well, it seems like in the history of youth ministry that relationships have been an incredibly significant thing. And probably, I guess you could make an argument in my own country, in the United States, that since the 1950s, we've had this thing called relational ministry, and relationships have been really a significant piece. And I think that has a ton to do with cultural changes and a rise of a popular culture, a rise of a consumer culture, the undercutting of larger fabrics of family, more smaller families and things like that. So youth ministry started to talk about relationships and the need to be in relationship. And it's been used mainly as an evangelism strategy, at least for the first few decades of that. But things started to transition, and I think while it was in some ways an evangelism strategy, it was really there to repopulate the church with young people, mainly because for some reason parents were no longer able to make a case for their kids to be there, or in other words, the church had to compete with other consumer and adolescent cultural things there. So in many ways, youth ministry as its own history within the United States really was about trying to make a case for kids to still come to church, and in many conservative contexts to hold on to their religious commitment, especially when secularism kind of floats into the context, as well as pluralism and things like that. So they start to strategize, how do you keep kids coming to church, or how do you make a case for our religion when there's all these different options and kids seem to, want to date or want to go to concerts and other things? How do we do that? And I think youth ministry really is the creation of that need. And so you see pre-1950s in the United States, there was youth ministry, but it was really based at larger bureaucratic denominational level. So a denomination like the Methodists would have a camp, and then they would have a denominational youth worker who oversaw all the youth ministry in the denomination or in the region or in the synod. But by the 1960s, 1970s, we start having local youth workers and congregations. And when that happens, it's the strategy to actually get kids engaged is to use relationships. And we start to hire these kind of para-church ministry people, these people who have been kind of doing missional things, and they get hired by the church. And they tend to use relational contact as a way of getting kids to come to church, being able to hear their evangelistic message. And so relationships become a significant piece, really because the culture changes a great deal. And it's no longer kind of de facto Christian or religious, or at least there's this divide in generations in some ways, which has everything to do with the reconceptualization and the new conceptualization of this thing called teenagehood and adolescence. So relationship becomes a huge piece because teenagers become almost alien creatures compared to adults. And so now we hire a cool relational agent to go and make contact with our kids and therefore make a case for the Christian faith. Now that serves a purpose, but it has an intrinsic problem with it. And the intrinsic problem is that if the whole point of youth ministry is to somehow be this agent who builds relationships with kids to get them to come to church, or to make a case for the Christian faith, or to assure parents that their kids won't fall into some kind of moral abyss or something. What's the problem with it is that the relationship itself serves another purpose. That the relationship and being a relational agent, being in a relationship with young people, really at the end of the day isn't about the young person at all. It's really about the goal of repopulating the church or helping kids be good. It really is not about the humanity of the young person. So my own experience is that, I started youth ministry in the mid-90s, was I had been trained on all of this stuff. And I was pretty into it. I mean, I read stuff, and I was trained by these big organizations and read all the popular youth ministry books. And then I took a job in suburban Minnesota, which is what we call in the United States flyover country. Not anything in the Midwest, you just fly over between LA and New York, or Seattle and Miami. I mean, it's real America in many ways, but it's not where the media focuses or new trends arise. And so I was doing ministry in Middle America and was doing relational ministry. And it seemed to be kind of working. I mean, it seemed to work all right. And then I took a job, went to school and took a job in Southern California. And I started to realize that all of the stuff that I had been taught, particularly about relationships in youth ministry, wasn't really going to work. And what had happened is I got invited to take a position at a large Presbyterian church that had a very classic youth ministry program. And this church was located in Glendale, California. And so most of the people who actually went to the congregation were white and economically mobile, had economic advantage. And the church itself was located down in this, what we called the flat area of Glendale, where there was all the commerce of the city was around there. And there were bungalows and apartments that also surrounded the commerce and surrounded this church. And most of the people who went to the church lived up in the foothills. And these, again, were these mainly white, economic advantaged kind of people. And that's who populated the youth ministry, of course. Well, one Wednesday night, the kids from the bungalows and apartments that were blocks away from the church showed up on the church steps. And I got hired to bridge the gap between these kids in the neighborhood and the congregation, because I had done relational ministry and done it fairly successfully in my middle America town. So I started and I launched in with full blessing of the church, do relational ministry. This is what we want. And it took me about 2-3 days to realize I had no idea what I was doing. Now, I was working with kids who were coming from really difficult neighborhoods, a lot of gang violence, things like that, were more ethnically diverse than the congregation itself. And they weren't taken with my relational contact. I mean, I would come up to them at school, and I would do what I was taught in popular youth ministry, is that, you go to where kids are. So I would go to where they were, and I would walk up to them, and I was told that, as long as I was cool enough, and as long as I could talk to them about things they like to talk about, they would welcome me into a relationship with them. And then I would have I would be able to have the power to influence them towards where I needed to influence them to. But I'd walk up to these kids and say, "Hey, how you doing?" And they would literally say, "Get the F out of my face." And so what do you do when this happens? No one had ever told me what you do when this occurs. I mean, no one ever told me in any Doug Fields book I've ever read, what do you say when a kid says, "Get the F out of my face"? Okay. Or I take these kids out for a burger and a Coke, which you're supposed to do. I mean, this is what my classic youth ministry forefathers had said to do. Take kids out and hang out with them and, talk to them about their lives, and then they'll be receptive to the gospel. Then they'll be open to hear the gospel. And I would take these kids out, and I could barely get them to say anything significant at all. I could barely get them to stop screwing around, to listen to anything I had to say. And then I would drive them home in the fog that had condensed on my windows. As they're in my back seat and I'm dropping them off, they would write rival gang signs on it. So when I turned around and pulled back out through their neighborhoods, my life were in danger. And then I would confront them about this, and they just thought that was hilarious, So I had these kids, but the irony of the whole thing is that they continued to show up. They didn't want anything to do with my relationship, but they continued to show up. Well, I think the way that really ministry and theology come together and work is that they're really born out of our core experience and reflecting on our experience. And so I had to start reflecting on my own experience, not only this experience of feeling like an utter failure in ministry, like I was supposed to be doing these relational things, and they weren't really working.